Hello Internet, I'm Jackie Fox, and for the next few videos, we're going to be talking about the Ukraine-Russia conflict, as well as a number of other conflicts and how they relate to this, taking us on a trip around time, around history, and around the world itself, trying to decide how past events may influence this. I'm going to try to take the generally broadest perspective possible here, but also the broadest variety of perspectives. So no one should expect this to be particularly orthodox, and don't expect it to be particularly short either, because, oh boy, there's a lot to cover. And first, the obvious disclaimer that since certain parts of this are going to be referencing an ongoing humanitarian crisis in the world, and one that is sometimes developing very quickly, we're getting new updates all the time in our information about how things are going on the ground, and how different geopolitical powers are acting. In preparation for this series, I've watched footage of the Finnish president, the German diplomats. I've seen perspectives from all over the world. I've seen all sorts of stuff from Ukraine as well. And I want to say I've not been on social media for any of this. And with the exception of the YouTube community tab, looking at certain people who were rebroadcasting certain social media and on-the-ground news highlights from Ukraine, I really haven't throughout the whole process. So I haven't actually seen a lot of the fake news that people have made videos about. The video game footage being insinuated to be happening in Ukraine, those kinds of things. With the exception of the Ghost of Kyiv. That one is particularly popular across the board. And as it pertains to that, I don't really care that that's fake news. I mean, it's a cool story, and if that motivates you ultimately, maybe the Ghost of Kyiv should not go down in history for being much more than a meme. Because they don't exist, obviously. Anybody who knows about, like, ace pilots and that kind of thing, you know this just can't be real. But at the same time, it's probably incredibly motivating for certain people. And there's a long history of war memes and their use in times of crisis in the military. For example, there was the "Kill Where He Was Here" meme that spread all over the world, even in the pre-internet age. Perhaps even being one of the first memes to reach a global spread. Because this is an ongoing crisis, we're going to be starting in the history. There's a lot of people who have talked about certain aspects of geopolitical history, kind of things like political power, soft power, hard power, proxy wars that we engage in, and why all of these things might affect this situation, or how they might provide illustrative parallels. My frustration in this is that history is complicated, and people often just reference a part or a statistic of a particular conflict, instead of studying how the entire conflict might be illustrative. That's more the perspective that I'm going to be taking during this series. There are a lot of long-running consequences of the Russian invasion of Afghanistan, for example, that are especially relevant now. Even beyond just the way people are talking about this, like, oh, the Soviet Union got their asses kicked in the Middle East over the course of a decade by Afghanistan. And yes, that is probably politically relevant, but it's also worth letting the story of that invasion play out. You know, how other countries are involved. And what are the lessons that Russia should have learned from this? What are the lessons that Americans should have learned from this? It's also worth talking as well, though, what lessons did the Afghan people learn from this? And where does that put them in the modern day? I think these are all incredibly relevant questions. And also, I guess it makes sense to get this out here first. I mean, I've made several videos already referencing manufactured consent before this. And I think that discussing one of those frameworks could be important in relation to this story. If you're on top of world news, especially if you're in my left-wing audience, I keep talking like I have right-wing viewers. I really have no idea. Let me know in the comments where you fall on the political spectrum and why you subscribed. But anyways, for my left-wing viewers, you've probably been hearing a lot about the American-backed Saudi genocide that's happening in Yemen right now. You may know that there's an estimated 13 million people in that country that are starving right now. And it seems like there's no side of the political or even mainstream media that platform the idea of supporting, say, Palestinians over Israel. Because for our government in general and our corporate structures, both parties have their alliances with Israel. We only see the fringes actually talk about what's happening to the Palestinian people. and the slow invasion that has been happening in Palestinian land for decades. It never really makes that many headlines here. In fact, it's more likely to make a headline that someone was willing to speak out about it. And for the most part, we certainly don't talk about Yemen either. And then in Afghanistan right now, one of the reasons I think it's important to ask how these geopolitical events got us to where Afghanistan is because the Afghan people are starving as well. In part because the Taliban don't strive to have good governing priorities, for one. They don't seem to be very concerned as much about human welfare and more typically Western liberal values, to say the least. And they're definitely not capital L liberal in political philosophy. It seems like this particular interpretation of Sharia law reigns with an iron fist there. And at the same time, when the US left Afghanistan, we took all the money from the Afghani government and we just left with it. And we're still holding it to this day. And that money is frozen in what's effectively a sanction against the Taliban. Which is kind of a weird place to be because I can't say for certain if you give them that money. And I think there should probably be preconditions on this as well. Like maybe give them half of it with the stipulation that they spend 80% of that feeding people. And then give them the rest if they do so. You know, I'm not really sure how much they would use to actually feed people if we didn't. Or to feed women. I don't know. I just don't understand what their priorities are. I do think we need to give them the money back in one way or another, though. And maybe preconditions are a good way to go to make sure this situation doesn't remain a humanitarian crisis. But one thing is for certain. As long as the US holds on to these funds, 0% of them, none of them, can be used to feed any civilians. That's for certain. And like how we're seeing people starving in Yemen right now, we're literally seeing people starve to death in Afghanistan. Like mothers, pregnant mothers, are starving to death. I mean, what can we say for their babies? They're being born premature and distinctly underweight because no one has the food to feed even a pregnant woman. That is the state of the country. And unless you listen to more left-wing media and analysts such as myself, or as opposed to the mainstream news, or maybe you listen to public broadcasting like PBS or Al Jazeera or NPR, maybe some of these sources discuss it. But really, you don't much hear about that. And for the most part, we've ignored the very real creeping invasion into Ukraine for the last 8 years now, with the exception of briefly caring about Crimea. But in the 8 years following that, we never really covered what happened in the Donbass. And when we did, we often referred to it more in the context of a civil war, or just kind of ignored that it was happening at all. And it's also worth noting that this would align us ultimately with the Russian propaganda about the matter, instead of seeing this as an attempt at a Russian-backed coup. So right now, after Vladimir Putin declared Donetsk and Luhansk independent of Ukraine, these two areas making up much of the Donbass, it's kind of weird, because he doesn't have any authority over Ukraine, for one. You know, it's like if he came to America and said, hey, California is now an independent state. Deal with it. But to tie this back to manufacturing consent, it's interesting how we seem to be worried about this all of a sudden. From the perspective of Chomsky, this might be because, in the eyes of the media, we have chosen to make Ukraine worthy victims. Which doesn't mean they did anything to deserve to be victims. But that as victims, they are worthy of our care and compassion, as opposed to unworthy victims, which do not warrant our attention, such as people starving in Afghanistan, people starving in Yemen, such as the people who are losing their ground day by day in Palestine. We ignore these because the media has determined that they are unworthy victims, that it's not worth it to care. And it's just so wild how abruptly everyone seemed to care. Everyone started to care that there was a humanitarian crisis in the making, when there are already active humanitarian crises going on. And in fact, this was an active humanitarian crisis before everyone and their mother decided to cover it on the news. Now, personally, as you can probably tell from the fact that I'm going to do at least this video, if not a series, on the kind of things that would lead to these sorts of humanitarian crises that we are seeing here, you can you should be able to tell that I think that all of the victims of these war crimes are worthy of our care and compassion, including the people of Ukraine, but not simply just Ukraine. So if you're one of the people who is asking yourself why all of a sudden the media thinks that we need to take this humanitarian crisis very seriously, you could say, and from the authors that I've read defending this in the mainstream media, there's this kind of narrative that seems to hinge upon a single word: European. Which has to be some sort of a small comfort to Ukrainians. But it also shows how shallow their designation as a worthy victim is. Because the Ukrainian people didn't necessarily think of themselves as a European country until relatively recently. And I'll be damned if the rest of the world has acknowledged it. Are they in the EU? Are they in NATO? No. For the most part, we don't think of them as a European country. We don't necessarily think of them as a Soviet country either. We think of them as being Ukraine. More importantly, the media and our political leaders often just don't think of them at all. So it's kind of weird that all of a sudden all of these reporters are saying that Ukraine is a European country. Because until this invasion happened, it felt like the world and the media were kind of uncertain as to whether they wanted to call Ukrainians European. And yes, I'm talking about the reaction largely in European countries. That's largely what I've looked at in addition to America. And one thing that all of these countries have in common with Ukraine is that they're predominantly white. And conversely, of all our unworthy victims, including groups like the Islamic Uyghurs in China, what they all have in common is their brown skin. It's not so much that I think that this is really the reason, though I do think that our general pattern of behavior does support at least discussing this perspective, because I can see how it looks that way. And there probably is something to that. But you could also say that the reason why we had such a uniform and different reaction to this is because it's such an obnoxious and clearly unjustified act of aggression. I feel like even though it's one of the most propagandized countries in the world, I think even most Russians realize, and have realized from really early on, that this war is unjustified by anything that Putin has said. And we'll be talking about all the things that he said in his speech to attempt to justify this invasion further out in this series. I think the most important thing here is that the crisis can be leveraged against a long-standing geopolitical competitor, Russia. For most of the West, it seems like we've all wanted a reason to make them our official enemy for a long time. Just look what we did with Russiagate, for fuck's sake. And I mean, there was smoke there. There just wasn't the fire that we reported. I covered the smoke myself, and on that note, there is an element of the Mueller report that I do want to bring into this, actually. I haven't heard anyone else talk about it, and while there's an interesting parallel to be found there, before we get into all of that, and as a way of getting into all of that, let's talk about the history.